I'm the current president of WAPA, Washington Association of Professional Anthropologists, and I'm happy to have you here. And we're happy to welcome our guest speaker tonight, Zev Casa. And I don't know if I pronounced your name properly, Zev. That's okay? Close enough?
Perfect, yeah.
Okay.
Perfect.
And before I turn it over to Monica, I want to say that the survey, WAPA has a survey of its members, and we worked on it really hard, especially Victoria Danner and Alexa worked on it as well, and Alexa Cummings. It's designed mostly so we can get a sense of who the members are, current members and former members are, and what sort of things you might be interested in having WAPA to do. So please, please, please fill it out. Barely takes 5 minutes. It's really simple survey. And the deadline's been extended to April 16th. So you've got time, and go do it right after this is over and it'll be done. So thanks, everybody. I'm glad everybody's here, and I'm going to now turn it over to Monica Gomez-Isaac. Monica, who is our program chair, by the way.
Thanks, Suzanne. It looks like we're matching today. We got the right close. We have another great evening for you this evening. We have Zev Casa with us. He's a PhD candidate in anthropology at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and also teaches anthropology at Montgomery College. His research in the Andes investigates the social and ecological transformations of highland landscapes during Spanish colonization and the enduring effects of communities today. He uses archaeological excavations, ethnographic, and oral historical research, as well as archival evidence to connect historical processes with the contemporary social issues of environmental justice and economic precarity. So I'm going to hand it over to Zev so he can begin his presentation and enlighten us all. Thank you so much, Zev, for joining us. The stage is yours.
All right, thanks, Monica, and thank you everybody at WAPA. This is a great opportunity for me, and I'm really grateful because I have been working on this it's sort of been consuming my life for the last 7 years, and I'm looking forward to hopefully defending this dissertation work in the next month or so. So this is sort of I'm taking it as me workshopping all this and getting some perspectives from those of you who have not been frantically writing it for the past year and can't get out of it. So it'll be great to sort of have some free will conversation afterwards, and I look forward to that. Also good to see a lot of familiar faces and names and some new ones, so thank you all for being here. So with that, I'm going to share. And I've decided after a full year of using Zoom that I'm going to try to share a screen in a different way here. So this could be a total disaster. All right, so do you now see the full slides?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, thank you again. And what I'm planning to do is to speak for maybe 40, 45 minutes or so. I'll try to keep it on the lower end. I usually end up really pushing it. But that's my plan, and then we can open it up. And let me also apologize for the really unnecessarily long title. It'll probably be the record for the longest title on the WAPA website. So here you can see that I've shortened it to be a more concise title. And so to start, I'd like to acknowledge from the outset the multiple ways that this research project which takes place in Ecuador is really connected to us right here in the mid-Atlantic. And similar processes of colonization and dispossession are common histories across the hemisphere, including here in the ancestral lands of the Anacostia and the Piscataway, and diverse native communities who have navigated centuries of displacement and legacies of violence. So it's important to historicize these legacies, and that's a project that I attempt to work toward in my own projects, in my own work. And it's also a global story in very real economic ways, because the flowers that we buy here in the US and here locally at many of the florists really are coming from the same lands that I'm going to be describing in this talk. So we're really connected through these sort of global commodity chains as well. So the lens that I use to develop this project, it borrows approaches from political ecology and from some of the emerging literature of the Anthropocene, or what others like Donna Haraway and Jason Moore and others have termed the plantationocene or the capitalocene, or all sorts of scenes. But really it's the dramatic growth of the hacienda and plantation systems that were a defining signature of colonial expansion in the Americas. And the effects of this process transformed physical landscapes and social and labor systems to such a degree that they characterize this new global epic called the Anthropocene, which is dominated by the ongoing legacies of those systems. The concept of plantationocene emphasizes this historical transformation in land tenure as a constitutive moment in the making of human and environmental history. And the concept suggests that plantation-style agriculture fueled the displacements of people, plants, and other animals that wrought ecological transformation together with capitalist and imperialist expansion. And this image here is from Feral Atlas, which Amit Singh and her colleagues have put together just recently, and it's a really fantastic work, pushing the boundaries of what a book publication really is. So taking Cayambe, Ecuador, and Hacienda Guachala as an informative case, I asked in this project how ecological transformation impacted the everyday lives, economies, and social practices of residents who navigated those circumstances. So how did the introduction of new species like sheep, cattle, barley, and wheat to the Ecuadorian highlands affect everyday social, economic, and ecological relations of indigenous residents? How did ecological transformation and these new labor systems force growing forms of resource precarity for local families? And on the topic of food insecurity, I've found a lot of inspiration from the work of Amanda Logan and some of her collaborators in really applying the concept of food insecurity. And finally, despite the challenges and constraints of these new infrastructures of precarity, how did local families shape emerging forms of life in a changing agrarian landscape? So sort of transporting ourselves to the study area, we arrive at the center of the world, literally on the equatorial line. Hacienda Guachala, which you see there in the picture on the right, is located in the northern highlands of Ecuador, about an hour drive northeast of the capital Quito. And today located in the parish of Cangawa, which is made up of dozens of individual communities whose histories are tied directly to the Hacienda period since the 16th century. And the region is comprised of diverse ecological zones, with the lowest being around 2,400 meters up to the highest at the peak of Mount Cayambe at about 5,800 meters. These differences in altitude and these climatic niches have long permitted the production of diverse products. Today, the warmer subtropical climates of the lower valleys provide conditions necessary for the production of fruits, sugarcane, coffee. Above 2,500 meters, dairy products and export flowers dominate the Cayambe economy, while the rich volcanic soils of slightly higher elevations bear the crucial harvests of maize, potatoes, barley, wheat, beans, onions, and other cereals. And finally, in the highest zones known as the Paramo, these sort of high altitude grasslands, dispersed communities would stand the high winds and cold nightly temperatures to take advantage of those tundra-like pasture land. Here you can sort of get a sense of this ecological diversity. This is a view actually looking south. So you can see in the valley here at around 2,700 meters is Hacienda Guachala. And you can see all these flower greenhouses down here. And the hacienda itself is right at the edge of it. And moving up further into higher altitudes is the current parish center of Tangawa, which is this kind of middle altitude area. And you can see that agriculture, more intensive agriculture, has been going on all the way up to really these upper limits of the high altitude zone. And then a couple other sites of note is Quito Loma, which you see here, and Pamba Marta. So these are the kind of high altitude Paramo zones that also were part of a ring, sort of a line of fortress sites that I'll talk about in just a minute. In the pictures on the right, you can see this photo here. I'm assuming you can see my cursor, and I kind of crazily move it around. You can see in the top right photo that these hilltops are the ones that you can see right here. So this is a view actually looking from the top of Quito Loma to the north. So you're right here, we're on Quito Loma looking north. I mean, you can see how agriculture is really up to that final altitude zone. Here in the foreground, you see quinoa, and in the background there, you can see one of the flower. This is actually sort of a local family enterprise, not one of the bigger plantations. So it's important to note as a sort of background that even prior to Spanish colonization in 1534, this region was already undergoing significant population upheaval as a result of prolonged conflict with an expansionary Inca army. And the takeover of the area by the Incas only some 30 years prior to the Spanish. And the Pamba Marca Archaeology project, which I'm a part of, has long been investigating the hilltop fortress sites that you see here. And it's depicted in this image from the Chronicle of Huamanpoma from around 1615 that you see on the left. He depicts a confrontation between Inca forces and various enemies, including the Cayambe, and I've circled that down here. The Inca soldiers also holding a slingshot right up here, which was a common weapon at the time, and also one found in excavations by the project. So the two photos on the right are both photos from a fortress site called Quito Loma, a walled enclosure where there were caches of bola stones found that you can see here in this unit on the bottom here. These are sling stones, bola stones. And this was just one of a series of fortified installations across the study area. So to sort of take us into the colonial period, we have this prolonged period of conflict between Inca and local indigenous forces, ending around 1505. And then eventually the Incas are successful, they take over the area, they start reorganizing the population using typical imperial strategies of taking local people and moving them to other areas of the empire, forcing, in this area, they took 1,000 domestic units and they moved them to another area in southern Peru to work the coca fields. And then they took other people from there, from the south, and brought them up to this area. So there's a period of demographic upheaval by the time the Spaniards arrived by the 1530s. And it's initially the encomienda system that lays the foundation for the control of land and labor, which eventually sort of becomes this more intensified system of hacienda. In the hacienda system, by the 1630s, more or less in this area, really starts to reshape social and physical landscapes through ecological and labor transformations. And what I mean by that is they start with the introduction of sheep and cattle, barley, wheat, with all of these goods that they're then using to supply the urban markets of Quito. It really takes the power away from local indigenous leaders who no longer control the markets in native goods. And by 1700, we get this shift in the Obraje economy. Now, Obrajes are these sort of textile mills that were originally sort of in the southern highlands of Ecuador, supplying some of the mining centers of the Andes. And eventually they go, by around 1700, they shift to the northern highlands where this study area is. And so one historian, Galo Ramon, he estimates that around 100,000 sheep were grazing the area in Cayambe by 1700. So this is really an example of how new ecological relations change configurations of power in the area. And it's also important that this system of hacienda, as you can see in the note on the bottom there, by 1685, almost 80% of the indigenous population was laboring for the haciendas. So it's a really stark change in the labor system of the area. So Hacienda Guachala itself was granted an official license for an Obraje in 1700, and it would continue to operate until the middle of the 20th century. And at its peak, it was relying on over 400 laborers and their families. So this was a really huge, really massive enterprise. Obrajes were infamous for the abuse that the laborers endured. One historian referred to the major Obraje center as the sweatshop of America. And that's because of these, the record of these abuses in sort of the kind of original textile manufacturers, you could say. Guachala was really no exception to this. And in fact, in my research, I've found several cases where laborers were seeking emancipation from their labor debt as a result of the excessive lashings and jailings that they were subjected to. And according to the inventories, the estate inventories, the property did have several rooms used as jails, and there were other restraint devices like stocks that were listed in the inventories. So these facilities had everything necessary for the whole process, from shearing the sheep, cleaning and carding the wool, spinning and weaving the threads, dyeing the cloth, and eventually selling it to regional markets. And this was a really labor-intensive process, often in really stifling conditions, particularly from the heat from all the ovens that were necessary to the process. So here you can actually see a picture of, on the right, of an Obraje from around 1890 in an area just north of the study area. And it looks very similar to the sort of main hallway corridor of the Obraje at Guachala, with these columns, right? So it would have involved both indoor and outdoor operations. So I'm gonna try this out. This is sort of a flyover tour of the hacienda, and it's gonna take us a little bit of time to get into the actual estate. But this is drone footage, courtesy of Mark Willis, who's an amazing geophysical and drone professional. And what he was able to capture is sort of coming into the current lines of the property. And in the past, all of this would have been the estate. But today, the property line kind of ends around here. And you can see at this point, the main hacienda architecture. And if I pause it right here, this was previously the residence area, the residence wing of the property owners. This sort of main wing here with a kitchen area as well. Probably gardens and pig corrals, gardens over here as well. And today you actually enter the estate from here. And this is it's currently a hostel, not a hostel, a hotel, a fine hotel for domestic and international tourists who come here. So if we keep going, you can see the main patio. This is currently the main patio. And here, according to documents, it was likely that there were administrators, some of the higher ranking laborers who would have been quartered in this area. And over here, this is the old chapel. It's still sort of unclear to me exactly when this was built. Some say in 1580 when some of the original tracts of land were purchased. But I'm not sure about that. And there is a mural inside from 1757, which I'll show you. So somewhere in that period, it's very old. If we keep going here, this on the right side would have been the mill complex. It's actually currently the residence of the landowners, but it was formerly the mill complex, and I'll show that as well. And this area, this is a new chapel that was built in 1938. And this really was the original sort of entrance patio. You would have entered the estate through here, through this entrance. And this is the Obraje here. This is the main sort of work area for the estate previously. And then I also think it's interesting that the drone, as it went by, you can also see as you get past the property line, you're just overwhelmed with the greenhouses of the flower industry. So all of this former land of the Hacienda is now being reused in sort of a similar fashion to grow the flowers that feed our gift giving here in the United States and around the world. Okay, so let me show some zoomed in images of this. So this is the main patio that I described, and you can see the old chapel, the exterior of the old chapel here, and it would have looked quite a bit different according to photos from the 1930s. So this has undergone years and years of changes. Going inside the chapel, you can see here the mural that's rapidly deteriorating on the left side here. This is a close-up of it, which includes the date of 1757. And then this is the mill complex that I described right here, sort of abutting the adjacent hill that's right next to the hacienda. And so water would have come down. It would have been a big operation to get water down here and use it both for the mill to grind grains, but also probably would have supplied the fulling mill, which you need to sort of compress the textiles for part of the Obraje process as well. So with the growth of the hacienda system, and certainly by around 1700, local ecologies were experiencing major transformations. The intensity of the hacienda system pushed agriculture and grazing further and further into higher altitude zones that were previously not cultivated, eventually resulting in the encroachment all the way to the upper páramos that we see today. So this is the same image. You can see agriculture going further and further up. It also resulted in a sort of dual political organization in a kind of classic Andean sense, where there was an upper and lower administrative center. And so, of course, the lower center would have been Hacienda Guachala here in the valley, and the upper center would have been an annex Hacienda La Marta up here at the top, which was sort of overseeing the high altitude labors of grazing sheep, shepherding sheep, and even cattle up there. And here there was also cheese and all sorts of a cheese workshop and all sorts of operations going on down here in addition to the Obraje. So all of this labor was organized through a system of debt peonage known in Ecuador as the Huasipungo system. So I include this here. This is a Huasipungo labor contract, an example of one from 1899. And basically what it was forcing them into, it was a contract with the following stipulations. It said, I agree to work in the hacienda for a period of 5 years. I'll work at least 5 days each week. A wage of 5 cents per day will be paid to me. And I'll be given the accustomed huasipungo for the subsistence of my family and I. So in this case, a huasipungo basically means a place to build a small house and adjacent land on which to grow subsistence crops. Of course, they were given the worst and least fertile land, so usually that wouldn't be possible, or it wasn't enough to supply their family needs. It also says I've received an advance of 6 sucres and 15 cents, but under no circumstances will I be permitted to return this money, where I have agreed to pay it off through my labor. So through this contract, this was sort of the start of this relationship of debt that became increasingly difficult to get out of, if not impossible, and it kept families there for generations. The accounting documents are also really interesting. This one called the Libro de Rayas, basically was a tick mark for each day of work. And so I sort of think about this as a kind of performance of accounting documents. Others have talked about this for contemporary corporations and financial institutions, the ways that these accounting documents actually sort of have constitutive power. They actually change people and their behavior. And I think this was doing some of the same work as well. And so this is what a sort of typical wasipungo would look like. This is from the 1930s in the Cayambe area from a neighboring estate. And you can see at the bottom there what a typical sort of assemblage or a list of goods that would have been given to the laborers as part of the agreement. Of course, it would have been taken out of their salary to do it. Right? But I think it's important to highlight here how important barley had become in the local diet by this point. So barley became a really important part of the local diet, despite being an old world crop. Interestingly, the documents also show workers requesting additional items. So they were able to request at times of need or emergency, they could ask for additional goods from the hacienda. And they often did this to fulfill ritual obligations. So you'll see in the documents that they'll ask, for example, for maize or potatoes to put on a party, or for the fiesta, it'll say. Oftentimes they were requesting meat specifically for a pregnant wife. Another indication that that the diet was not sufficient in protein, and so they needed to basically put themselves in further debt to be able to meet those sort of protein obligations or protein requirements. But what I never saw requested for these sort of ritual obligations, whether it was parties or vigils, funerals, I never saw barley requested. What they were requesting was in maize, in potatoes, the sort of crops that have probably a higher status, a higher, a longer tradition of consumption, and also meat, which is also really a pre-colonial, also typical kind of foodways pattern that you would only eat meat really on special occasions. So what I tried to do in the project was to use archaeological excavations to look sort of more into the everyday lives of people who were living in arrangements like this, of the wasipungueras. And this is really rare. It's rare to have the opportunity to find these contexts because they're so ephemeral. This is why we have a bias in historical archaeology toward elite houses. But there were a few contexts that we were able to locate. And so I'm going to sort of shift into the archaeology here. Let me check my time here. I'm going to shift into the archaeology and explain just these three different contexts. So two of them are from the hacienda itself, Molino Loma and the Obraje. And then a third one is a really useful comparative context from this community of Pingumi, which has this kind of fame for being an independent community that always resisted the Spanish and then resisted the hacienda, and they were never wasipungueras. So it provided a useful comparative context. Okay, so the first one was in the Obraje, and you can see here, I love this photo from the 1930s because it shows what's no longer there. These walls are gone now. And so when I'm trying to look through the inventories and understand the organization of space, it was really hard because it'll describe entryways and the hallways and the walls, and none of them are there anymore. So this picture was helpful, and you can see the main entrance to the Obraje area here. So this was the entrance, and in this map, there's this image that would sort of be here. You would walk into it through here. So I excavated three different areas of this, and here you can see that what I found seems to have been the sort of main or one of the patios of the Obraje. So it was a stone cobble floor. The red arrows here are pointing to in situ faunal remains, mostly sheep and cow. So these were really interesting contexts where it was a floor, an occupation floor with mostly domestic material, ceramics and faunal remains on the floors. Here, the interpretation got a little confused because all of a sudden this floor and the associated wall then became super irregular, and I have no idea what happened here. But in general, the material is pointing to this kind of mixed domestic and work space. This other area of excavation, I was targeting this area really following GPR surveys because I was looking for latrines that, that according to documents had been built in the hacienda somewhere around the late 19th century. So I really wanted to find those latrines, which of course for archaeologists are a treasure trove of material and information. And I thought I had found it. I was convinced that I had found it because over here was this circular cut into the Kangawa bedrock. And then within it was this fill of ash and bricks and ceramic fragments like this here. But that was really it. It just ended up being a bunch of pumice at the bottom with almost nothing else in it. I think what it might have been for is to sort of place the ceramic vessels like this, which still is present at the hacienda. So some of these vessels used for the Obraje process. So I think this was really a work area, mostly work area. There wasn't the same sort of faunal and ceramics and all of that. So this was probably a work area, whereas this was more of a mixed use space. And then in this third area, and you can see it looks like here with these San Pedro cactuses. This room here, it's kind of abutting the room for the kind of accounting room, it's the scribe's room. So I excavated there as well and found additional examples of stone floors, stone cobble floors. And mixed into that was fill, either fill or maybe a midden area. There was a lot of really rich domestic material, including a mecate for grinding. The material there is sort of indicative of, again, a kind of mixed both domestic and work activities. So moving just up the hill was a second context. So what I was just showing you right here in the Obraje, and if you go up the hill on this mill hill in English, this was the second context known as Op 19. And so what we were really trying to do there was follow these surface features that we could see, and the project had actually done a couple small excavations there in 2003 and 2009. And so I was following it because there was so much material there. There were these Kangawa blocks, there was mud brick blocks here that formed perpendicular walls or architectural features. And then when we excavated them, it seems that there were two likely parts. So one is here, and you can see here what the sort of lithic collaborator calls an anvil, this kind of large grinding surface. Down here, a stone anvil. And then there was tons of faunal remains and some ash. So it appeared, and this was excavated in 2003 by the project, it appeared they thought of this as a hearth area. And then this one also seemed to be indicative of that as well, with the kind of orange burning of the blocks and associated artifacts. And these artifacts are really utilitarian wares. So you see a cooking pot up here. These are what are called locally tiestos. And tiestos are these flat griddles that you could toast grains on. Similar, I guess, to like a comal in Central America, for example. And so it looked like this, but these are sort of traditional components or typical components of an indigenous foodways or indigenous food preparation. And it's still used today as well. And then jumping to the third context here, which is Pingomi, and you might notice here on the image, you can see the concentric walls. So this is another fortress site. That is not where I excavated, however. I was interested in the terraces below because I wanted to see if it looked like there were domestic terraces, and it wasn't clear what period they dated from. And so we surveyed as a project. We found all sorts of different structures led by community members. And so we did some more in-depth investigations. And I think this got cut off a little, but with this another drone image, you can sort of see, hopefully, at the very top is kind of the outer fortress wall. And then down the slope are a couple of different structures. And this one is the one at the bottom where you can sort of see people. This was kind of the biggest and had the most surface ceramics. It seemed like it was domestic. And so we put 3 different test units in that structure, which you can see here. And the most important context was in the corner, we actually came up right on a hearth, another hearth. So you see the hearth here with a floor, hardened floor, the hardened kangawa from the burning. And again, associated artifacts, which included this jar here, this sort of yellow and green glazed jar. So this was actually the most complete one that I was able to find in the whole project. So just sort of summarizing the kind of takeaways from the artifacts, and I can give more detail if anyone is interested, but sort of the broad takeaways here are that the assemblages, they did vary somewhat across the 3 contexts, but all were primarily dominated by locally made coarse utilitarian wares. So cooking wares, food preparation, and it's also indicating local markets. And this is something that in oral histories, former wasipungueros also described, that there were peddlers from places like Otavalo who were selling things like salt and ceramics. And that's where they would get their goods. So these things weren't provided by the hacienda, they had to get that themselves. And so they were using these sort of local market networks and bartering between them. There was some variation in access to what I call here Indayan mayolikas, and this is a ceramic category that we're still trying to figure out, particularly its chronology. But basically these are kind of Indayan-made sort of imitations of European mayolika ceramics, or even of Panamanian mayolika ceramics. But even though they're more pretty, they were not as frequent as the sort of more utilitarian wares. There was also a dearth of imported refined wares or manufactured goods like alcohol or medicines. So these 2 glass fragments here are 2 of the only ones that I recovered in all of those excavations. This one's actually a Murray and Landman Florida water bottle. There was also an earring, right, a metal earring. But in general, there was almost no access or appetite for these commodity goods, these manufactured goods. The faunal assemblage was dominated by cow and sheep, which makes a lot of sense for the area at the time. But there was also little evidence for the laborers hunting wild animals, for example, to supplement their diet. It really was just cow and sheep for the most part. And so I kind of take this as a process of incorporation of these new grains and meats. So these new old world grains like barley, sheep, cattle, but incorporating them into already existing repertoires of food production and serving. And you can tell from the faunal remains how they're cooking them as well. Seems mostly like they're still preparing stews and sort of traditional meals, but they're doing it with new ingredients. They're just sort of incorporating new kind of ecological assemblages. This is in stark contrast to the inventory that's recorded for the haciendados, for the landowners. And you can see here, it's sort of typical for historical archaeologists around the hemisphere, where you see these individualized matched sets of tablewares, kind of evocative of the individualism of liberal capitalism. And so I want to kind of shift and take that into the kind of early 20th century and into today. And point out that in the 1860s, one of the most important political figures in Ecuador, the president for much of the 19th century, was actually in charge of the estate for about 5 years. And he had a lot to do with this introduction of eucalyptus trees, the Australian eucalyptus, in the late 19th century. In some ways, started at Guachala in a couple other areas, but this was a major impetus for the spread of eucalyptus forests. So it's sort of another ecological transformation, which has become kind of commonplace. And in fact, I've done sort of virtual fieldwork with a local organization. They've been doing agroecology, and they incorporate the eucalyptus. It's become kind of an indigenous assemblage, medicinal assemblage that's sort of taken for granted part. It's considered an indigenous good, even though it came from Australia in the late 19th century. So more examples of this incorporation. In 1954, things really boiled over. There were a lot of complaints of abuses, of not being paid by the laborers against the administrator. And there was an uprising in 1954 with all sorts of different accounts of how it went. But there was a violent police response to it. At least 4 people died, many were injured. And some of the elder individuals that I interviewed who were former Huastepungueros, they recall that moment. They all brought this up, being able to hear the gunshots from that time. And so it's very clear in their memory. And it was sort of after that event that actually the estate began to give parcels of land to some of the laborers, sort of anticipating the agrarian reforms, even before they happened officially in 1964. And so it's at that point, in sort of the late 70s and early 80s, that we get the rise of the flower industry. So the neoliberal environment at that time, and this was encouraged by like the IMF and USAID, all of these sort of investment banks, they shifted options for investment and production in the area, and they made Cayambe among the most important flower production centers in the world, along with Colombia, Kenya, and the Netherlands. And so new policies deregulated markets, and it spurred exports, all of which encouraged the investment in a new non-traditional agricultural product, flowers. And the investments were particularly attractive for the abundance of local cheap labor that could be employed as wage laborers on these new rose farms. And that cheap labor were, of course, the former Huastepungueros and those who were trying to make a living on the lands that were given to them or that were sort of left over there. The biophysical environment also favors the production of roses because being on the equator, there's consistent daylight hours, there's exposure to sun directly overhead, and cool temperatures in the mountainous region that can be controlled with the aid of greenhouse infrastructure. And so with the first flower plantation established in Cayambe by 1983, the industry grew quickly, and you can see the difference in the landscape from 84 to 2021. All of this is the proliferation of flower greenhouses across the landscape. And recent numbers indicate that despite a major drop in exports during the early pandemic period in 2020, the industry has recovered, and it's actually seen massive growth, even over 200% over the previous year. And you can imagine they're ramping up now for Mother's Day coming up next month. And every time there's a major holiday, production really picks up. So, and you can see in these photos, there's sort of different ways that they control these flowers. So this is going to probably China or Asian markets. The aesthetic tastes are different. Here in the United States, the taste is for natural colors. Right? So you can see the difference in how they treat the flowers and breed them as well and guide them. So a major question for this project was to understand how the hacienda history echoes through contemporary life today in the region and how people carry forward this history. And I came to realize that the tensions that have erupted as a result of the flower industry really manifest in the annual harvest or June solstice celebrations, the most important in the region. And so I'm gonna kind of shift here in the last couple minutes just to talk about these tensions in the area today. Now, the San Pedro festivals were originally in the hacienda itself, and this was put on by the landowner, who actually you can see here, giving alcohol to the laborers. And this was part of the kind of moral pact between landowner and laborers. You have to put on this annual fiesta. So laborers, communities, they would go down to the estate to celebrate, drink, eat, dance. You can see them here with the musical instruments. You can see here another ceramic jar here on his back. So they're making all sorts of homemade alcohols, guarango from agave, chicha from corn. They even make chicha from barley, another interesting incorporation. And so they're celebrating in very similar ways to how they celebrate today, dancing in circles with the instruments, dancing and singing. And today, it's actually moved off of the hacienda. It's shifted to the parish center at Kangawa. So the communities now go to the center of Kangawa. And so dozens of communities, they dance and sing their way down to the main plaza for the taking of the plaza. And some sing and dance with their own instruments, but others are also accompanied by parade floats, which are mounted on cars or trucks, like you can see on the left. And in these photos, you can see two separate floats that I think highlight the complex intertwining of local cultural practices with distinct ecologies. So one presented a large mannequin on the right side of an indigenous woman, represented with traditional local dress, though with white mestizo complexion. And her clothing was partially made with roses of all colors grown at local flower plantations. And then another float was made on the bed of a pickup truck on the left side. And it was decorated with a broad assemblage of mostly native plants, commonly used in local diets and medicines. It was embellished with stalks and plants like maize, potatoes, quinoa, wheat, and other herbs and medicinal plants. And then on the truck bed, an older woman was hard at work grinding and weighing maize into flour with a stone mortar and pestle, similar to the ones that were excavated in the project. And so the vessels, the grains, and the woman, they formed this sort of assemblage that was evocative of local social identity and historical memory. And I think the two floats offered onlookers for two distinct representations of life in the region and the complex socio-ecological transformations and adaptations that have manifested over the last several centuries. And today there are ongoing debates about the merits of economic development and the ethics of work and environmental care in the region. And so on the one hand, there's a struggle to maintain traditions of collective labor organization like the Minga that you can see on the left. And on the other hand, some are really leaning into the flower industry and its promise of the supposedly dependable, albeit dangerous and precarious work opportunities. And you can see these starkly represented in these photos are two visions of labor. And the movement for agroecology has really strengthened in Cayambe as a sustainable form of development, combining agronomic sciences with traditions of ancestral knowledge, oftentimes fostered by local organizations like Fundación Casa, and other, often in collaboration with international NGOs as well. And I think this is part of really a global movement, a global agrarian movement toward sustainable development. And so I'll finish here with thinking about these kind of new ecologies of power, as I phrase it. And today, the link between the former hacienda system and the new flower plantations are really palpable. And so here in this photo, you see the hacienda house that was formerly part of a Jesuit estate. It's now owned by an elite Ecuadorian family in Cayambe. And in the fountain, you see rose petals, which are taken from their flower plantation, which is located just next door. So tourists can go and visit the historic house They can also visit the flower plantation, and some of the photos from here are actually from that plantation. So I think this juxtaposition of the petals and the house, I think it highlights this kind of global struggle that we face in the Anthropocene, in this Anthropocene Plantationocene, between distinct models of economic futures. And I think it also highlights the importance of understanding the colonial histories of all of these different agricultural systems and models of development that are being that are prospering today. So I think the sort of historic aspect of it is really important in connecting and understanding what alternative futures might be, and really how the infrastructure put in place historically to make some of those economic models possible today. So I will wrap it up there and thank all of these people, tons of people that I would thank. And so I'll leave it there. If there are any questions or conversations, I'd be happy to partake in that. And thank you very much.
Zev, that was fascinating. Thank you so much. Like Zev said, we'd like to open it up to questions. There is the option to post your question in the chat below or raise your hand. Or just speak up if you have a question for Zev. So please feel free.
I saw Aaron Benson's hand was raised.
I was just clapping, not raising
my sorry.
Thanks for the applause, Aaron.
Yes. Harold?
It's very interesting. I enjoyed your presentation. I've been working for a number of years with Albert Ammerman, archaeologist in Calabria, Italy, and I was intrigued by your title because most of my field research, I'm a cultural anthropologist. I'm an old fart, but anyway, I've worked with pastoral people throughout my life, and as well as raising, or at least having 400 sheep take care of me for years here in upstate New York. And I'm interested because there are a lot of parallels. We actually have worked from the Neolithic period to the present in terms of the archaeology, but I'm interested in the evolution of the landscape and its use, which you document quite effectively. You mentioned the site that was a fortress site, the last excavation, and that this had been a site of resistance historically. Are there any smallholders that are holding on or evolving, developing in the area? It seems to me, listening to it, that there are folks like that, and I'd kind of be interested in hearing about that, what you had to say.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that. There certainly are. So it's not all large plantations. There are still over 50 or 60 communities in the area, and they have different approaches to the flower conundrum. Some of them are choosing to limit the encroachment of flower plantations on their communal lands. Some of them are allowing a certain number, so people in the community can actually open a flower plantation. And oftentimes these are former workers who decide that work's not for me, I don't want to do that anymore, but I'm going to open up my own small flower farm and then sell those flowers to the bigger flower plantations. So that's happening. But there's also a push to simply keep them out. And I've worked with groups, women's collectives, organic collectives in Kangawa, in the area, who have formed those collectives to do agroecology specifically as an alternative, as an economic alternative to the flower industry. And so They are continuing to use the same sort of ancestral techniques, new crops. I would say sheep, there are still sheep in the area, but once the Obraje and the textile industry declined, it no longer became as profitable. So there are still sheep, but not nearly in the numbers as in the past. And those are primarily up in the higher altitude communities. So there is a lot of family growing. And what's been happening, Cayambe actually has its first indigenous mayor currently. And he's been a huge proponent of agroecology, and he's set up these agroecological fairs. And so these women, mostly women, they're actually selling those goods either at agroecology fairs, or like farmers markets, either locally, or they're even going into Quito. They're selling guinea pigs, so they raise guinea pigs in their own households. So certainly it's a very powerful economic alternative, but that's sort of the heart of the tension, the smallholders versus the work in the farm, in the plantation. And I would say it's generational too. There's a generational component.
The land in the upland areas, that's not, is that controlled by the communal communities that you mentioned, or is it, is it controlled at any level by the hacienda?
So there's an interesting article, an interesting research study that was just done in one of those upper altitude areas, and they were talking specifically about this. That really, there can be this sort of stereotyped impression that that these communities just sort of know how to use the land, what the most sustainable practices are. But in reality, their research was finding that some of these people were saying, well, this is how the hacienda did it. They did agriculture here. They did controlled burnings in the grasslands, and so that's how we're going to do it. And it was actually in collaboration with local NGOs that they changed those practices in the upper altitude Paramo. And they formed a sort of cooperative or a collective of communities where they all work together to preserve communal land and limit the reaches of those agricultural cultivation. And so you can't graze or plant above certain areas. And that's really a product of the sort of political power of these communities coming together as an organized unit. So that's all communal work.
Well, I could ask questions all night, but I should leave the room for some other folks. Thank you.
Well, and I'd love to hear more about the sort of sheep from a cultural anthropology perspective about sheep, shepherding and those sorts of practices. It's something I need to read more into.
Well, I'll email you in terms of, following up.
Great, thank you.
Hi, Zeb. Thank you for the presentation. I had a question. You mentioned the IMF and investment banking, and I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit more on their role in all of this, and especially if you're talking about some resistance to the flower industry. How are investment bankers and the IMF handling that kind of resistance?
Yeah, well, another great question, and I actually, this was such an important question to me that I pursued this United Nations work. I'm a graduate fellow in the United Nations Association because I wanted to know how it was that this came to be in rural areas, what the sort of logic was for doing this kind of development in places like the area where I've been doing this dissertation research. And I guess, what I've found is that at the time, agrarian reform in the 1960s, it gave back some parcels of land to local families, but it wasn't enough, and particularly over generations, you're splitting that land between more and more people, and it simply wasn't enough. There's the entry of Holstein dairy cows. So the area is still very much a dairy area. But that wasn't very labor intensive. I mean, you don't need as many laborers per area to do that. So the flour industry was the solution, that you would need a whole lot more laborers to work smaller tracts of land. And so they thought it would be a great way to give employment to these laborers who needed the work. And what was happening at the time is that people were actually leaving, going to the cities. They were migrating out of their communities. And so a lot of people thought it was a good idea, a way to incentivize people staying, because there was opportunity right there in their own communities. So that was the impetus. And I've looked into USAID and IMF, some of these development banks and what they were intending. I mean, the way that they did this was also by getting rid of export tariffs and things like that with the United States, basically making it easier, opening up those markets to send them. But of course, you can think about how it makes it cheaper for us. I mean, it benefits us because we get cheaper flowers. Not that roses are cheap here. In that area, you can buy a whole dozen roses for $1 or $2, fresh off the stalk. But it opened up a whole market. They started paving roads, making the infrastructure to make this possible. There's a new airport just half an hour from there. So all of the infrastructure, they really took a holistic approach to this development plan. And really, it's actually been pretty successful in economic respects. And it was interesting to see. I thought, as a boom bust economy, I thought that the pandemic might show at its end, but it seems not to have been the case. In fact, people really want to send flowers to each other. You don't have to. You can do that from right here at our computers. We can just order flowers from Ecuador and Colombia and get them shipped to whoever we want. So I guess it actually is a really great business idea for a pandemic. So yeah, I don't know if I forget if I've answered the question, but I think it's common to this sort of Anthropocenic present right around the world, where IMF and this they caused problems in Ecuador in 2019 as well, with these austerity measures, and it caused indigenous protest against those austerity measures. So it's an ongoing history of interactions between these investment banks and local communities.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Zev, I have a question for you. It stems from a book called Flower Confidential by Amy Stewart, and she looks at the flower industry in this shift from the nations like the Netherlands and the United States, where there were major growing sectors out in California or in the Netherlands as well, but due to environmental concerns and restrictions, a lot of that has since been exported to places that have fewer restrictions, so Latin America, Africa. And my question deals with any focus that maybe you have found associated with those environmental restrictions, because a lot of flowers, in order for them to successfully grow at the scale for mass, production and export, they use a lot of fertilizers, and that can be very dangerous for application, for soils. Did you look at any of that? And if so, what were your findings on the environmental impacts of that?
Yeah, there's been there are several colleagues, scholars who have looked at that, anthropologists, geographers, and one specifically in Kangawa actually looked at, well, a couple. One was specifically looking at the ways that those plantations affected community participation. So this is not related necessarily to the environmental impacts, but in the sense that if you're taking, it employs a lot of women as well. That was also one of the ways they encouraged it, is that it would provide economic alternatives to women. But at the same time, these workers were then sort of not complying with their communal obligations. They weren't going to communal meetings and that sort of thing, and going to the collective work parties. So there were a couple of studies, and there's some disagreement on how it's affected that. There's some disagreement on the extent to which it has altered community engagement. But others have also looked at the environmental impacts and the rise of fair trade, the impact of fair trade on those plantations. So the one that I visited, the one that I showed at the end, or I guess you're not seeing the same, it's on my screen. The one at the end there, that plantation, they claim, that they use all safe pesticides and all these things. They often have their own clinics, and that became necessary because there were so many health issues. So they have their own clinics on the property, and that's one of the reasons that I kind of say, in typical neoliberal form, they've become their own kind of state by proxy, that they fulfill all the roles of a state on their own property. They have daycare centers. They build parks for communities, whatever it takes to allow them into the community. But there are many of the reasons that people left that employment was because of those environmental concerns and the harsh chemicals from the pesticides and the fertilizers. So people leave the industry because of that. They're in talking with people in oral history, they would all claim that their crops used to be much bigger, right? The fava beans used to be bigger. They used to grow more plentifully, and it's because of the winds blowing all the chemicals from the flower plantations. They blame it on that for limiting their own food growth. And in terms of water, it also caused what's called this kind of hydrosocial territory. Irrigation, even in the Hacienda system through today, was an important resource. And so when the flower plantations came in, they kind of monopolized the water because they needed, for their own growth. And so that has also come under, it's been an extraordinary history of political power on the part of indigenous communities, because they've also been able to come together to form these collective organizations and take control of some of those irrigation systems. Now it's always kind of fraught, and it's not a clear story, but there's certainly environmental, and to your question, they also those communities forced regulations on the part of the government for those environmental concerns. Whether that's, real rigid or not, or they had to get these licenses saying that they were following protocols, but who knows, in the thick of it. But it's certainly a big concern in the area.
Thank you.
Hey, Zev, great talk. I'm a little curious to learn more about the tourism industry, kind of the idea of the rose tourism, something I never thought of, but it made sense when you mentioned it. It kind of reminded me of like winery tourism in Western Virginia, that sort of thing. But I was wondering about other tourism in the area. Is it really all built around sort of this rose industry, or is there like a tourism industry built around a narrative of Inca resistance, or even just like local ecological tourism connected to more traditional agricultural practices?
Yeah, great question, and I know where you're coming from, I think. Food is certainly a part of the tourism, and I would say the flowers are absolutely not a tourist draw because the one that I showed is one of the only ones that lets people in. When I run field schools down there, I've visited different plantations and I've asked them, can I bring these 40 students in? And they all say, no, absolutely not. You can't bring anyone in here. And I'm stopped at the huge gate, and that's it. So no, they don't want visitors. The only one that does is that one with the old Jesuit Hacienda. And they do it. There is, part of the tourism is the haciendas themselves. Most of them have been turned into hotels. So you can kind of go on a whole track from Quito up to Otavalo and further north, staying in very fancy hotels for hundreds of dollars a night. I made my way into one, claiming that I was interested in holding my wedding there, and that's why they let me in. And so that's part of the draw there. The main tourist draw is also there's the middle of the world. There's the equator line. And so the owner's son, the landowner of Guachala, his son actually built this equatorial line, I don't know what the site. Right, so there's a big post there right on the equatorial line, and he's an astronomer. So he's put a lot of work into that. So people do stop on the way, but basically they're going up to Otavalo, which is this famous tourist area in Ecuador, with all sorts of indigenous crafts and this huge market where all the tourists go. So really it's ecological, it's food, and it's going to Otavalo to get souvenirs to bring back home. And the ecological part is becoming more important. Some of the community groups that I've worked with in Kangawa itself, they're actually trying to do and develop ecotourism. And so they're looking for the field projects for the schools to be a part of that. They want these communities in the upper altitude areas to figure out how they can get tourists there to visit those fortress sites, because people just don't go. It's too out of the way. The roads until recently were not good enough. It's a whole day to get up there. It's brutal in terms of the altitude and the cold. So it's not really like a pleasant tourist experience unless you're kind of more adventurous, and then it's amazing, it's awesome. So there's an ecological component, there's the fortresses, but those are not being used to their fullest potential, I would say, for sure.
A quick follow-up, if I may. Is there any concern about potential impacts of local inflation related to the growth of the tourism industry and the impacts on the local farmers in particular?
Good question. I don't think, not that I've heard of. I could be missing conversations. It could be a concern, but I think they're really going all out for tourism. And local elected leaders have really been pushing infrastructure projects to get tourism in. I think they're not concerned about inflation. They're more interested in getting some sort of economic stimulus coming in.
Any other questions for Zev?
Hi, Zev. Thanks
Hey,
for the
Ron.
talk. Excellent talk. You mentioned Kenya, which I spent quite a few years living there, and they have a tremendous flower industry there, roses and carnations and et cetera, et cetera. And they're very secretive about having people visit. They never want any tourism at all. But what were you, did you find any overlap between the flower industry around the world? I mean, Kenya is also right on the equator, exactly like Ecuador. So just an open question.
Yeah, I think there were certainly common elements to how those areas became flower centers. One is, of course, the equator and the sort of biophysical properties of those areas. And then, of course, cheap labor.
Yeah.
Where you can have those flowers produced at much lower costs. I haven't, in my research, I haven't really looked into those other areas much. It's something I'd be interested in doing, but I haven't really done much in the way of comparing the two areas. So
Export potential too. Kenya had a great airport, so they were very close to that.
Right.
So
right.
and of course, all their stuff
And
went directly to Holland.
Right. Do you know if it was the same development banks that were incentivizing it there?
I imagine so, because we had a lot of World Bank and other big banks in Kenya, and they were really into financing big projects like you were talking about. So I'm sure it's very similar.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a good question.
I have a question. In terms of secrecy on the part of the flower industry, why would you be so hesitant to open up your farms if you could make extra money off of tourism?
Yeah, I think some of them are built for that. Some of them are built for that tourist draw, because the tourists, they don't necessarily want to go just to see the flowers. If they can see the flowers and they can go to a historic hacienda,
Right.
and they can tour around and eat these delicious bizcochos and cheese, local cheese, then that's more of a draw. But these other ones, they're using pretty harsh labor practices, maybe not the happiest labor force. And so it's kind of a whole system where these yellow buses are busing laborers in from their communities into the plantations. It's like, it looks like a yellow school bus, and they bring the workers in. And the other ones are coming from the high hilltop communities on their motorcycles. If they can afford it from their salary, they take the motorcycles down to the plantations. It's also the labor force is changing. There are workers from Colombia, from Venezuela. I think they've also seen that they've gotten harsh scholarly treatment. So there's a lot of things being written about them. So I think they just prefer not anyone in there criticizing them, or they just want to focus on their production, and that's it. So that's my sense of it.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. I was wondering.
So Zev, this is Ed Lebo. Thanks for great talk. I'm curious about the archaeology and the curatorial arrangements for the material that comes out of the excavations. Could you talk a bit about your local arrangements?
Yeah, so it's all done under the auspices of the INPC, the National Cultural Patrimony. We store those artifacts, and this is part of the broader project, the Pambamarca Archaeology Project. We store them, basically the local parish officials are sort of custodians of those artifacts as of now. And so they're being stored in secure areas and boxes in the parish area itself. The artifacts from the hacienda, the landowners haven't asked, for those to be, well, they would, because they're a tourist, they're a hotel, they would love for some of those exhibits to be, or for there to be artifacts for exhibits and things like that. And all of those are, potentials for the future. There are ways to work with that. But as of now, they're being stored in town, and eventually in the future that'll be sort of taken care of and stored more permanently in the sort of the national repositories. So that's where it is right now.
Sev, to follow up on Suzanne's question, about why you wouldn't want tourism. Just for comparative purposes, in the situation in Calabria, it's a mar de plastico, which is what you have evolving there. But in the case that I'm operating in, it's primarily strawberries, primezia, early season, hit the market for Northern Europe, for Northern Italy and so forth. There's tourism, it's what the agroturismo. So it's a sort of thing that you might find some of your local people could set up a house and get some folks to come and see the beautiful area and so forth. But those flower folks, they don't, the big producers, they don't want anybody near that stuff for reasons you started to intimate. Also, Monica's point, every time anywhere in the world where you see this kind of heavy agro-industrialism, greenhouses wall to wall for miles, it's a mess. It's a soup in terms of pollution. It's a soup in terms of water being extracted and being polluted. And as was indicated, you mentioned you've got labor. Right now, the reason you're setting it up there is it's cheap local labor. There's always a cheaper labor supply. Higher up the hill, when that doesn't work, other countries, as you started to say. And that's what we had in Italy, and it's all organized by Ndrangheta. So unfortunately, this is the trajectory for this kind of industrial development. I had one other quick question in terms of marketing. Is the principal market, you mentioned China, but is the principal market United States or Northern America?
Oh, that's a good question.
Or Europe?
Yeah, I want to say it's the United States, but I'm a little rusty on the numbers. The last time I looked at the numbers, they certainly ship to both. I think the United States is the most exported to. It also probably depends on the plantation. So, for example, the current landowner of Guachala, he owns some land where he grows flowers. These blue flowers, the name I'm forgetting. And so he grows them as well, uses the eucalyptus trees actually as a windbreak to prevent frost, sort of logical innovation. And he ships those to sort of like parades in the United States. So I believe it's mostly the United States coming from Ecuador.
Because one of the interesting things that happened with a lot of offshore production, not just in flowers, but in vegetables, high-end vegetables and so forth. When the interruption occurred in Europe with the volcano in Iceland and air travel was cut back, that really disrupted lines of supplies. And these things are so finely tuned that it only takes a couple weeks to really screw things up. And I just wondered, if in a sense there had been some insulation because, they were focused more on a North American or Chinese market. Again, it's a really, you've got a fascinating study that you're working on. I really love the fact that you're working at ethnohistorical, archaeological, and cultural levels, contemporary levels. To be congratulated. Thank you again.
Thank you. And I'm reminded of some of the other products in the Andes, like wine and pisco, because I see Brendan Weaver here, and he's worked with that industry down there, which is a sort of whole other industry. Whereas in my case, the flowers are just for export, not for tourism. With wine and pisco, this grape brandy, my sense is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my sense is that there are actually a lot of opportunities for tourist visitation and encouraged, and it's part of the route, the pisco route, right, through Peru. So that's a very different, sort of tourist circuit using those products that are historic, that have been, part of the colonial period and ever since. So it's a very different story of using those local products, using those agricultural products for tourism.
Can I go? Okay. Hi, I'm Leslie Brownrigg. I've worked in Ecuador, and you sort of skipped over. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. You kind of skipped over the agrarian reform, yet you mentioned that there are some cooperatives forming, and I'm wondering, because the agrarian reform in Ecuador had the Guasipongueros and Arrimados and all those people form cooperatives on 15-year bonds, which they've paid off. Now, some of those cooperatives then dispersed, just broke up into family farms. But other cooperatives stayed intact and still exist. So I'm wondering whether some of these cooperatives that you say are starting to form are actually the same cooperatives that formed during the agrarian reform, or whether you know anything about that, because the pattern of where the haciendas were versus the freehold communities and the hacienda communities is very important in knowing where the old cooperatives were and where communal lands were. So,
Yeah, well,
so what about
yeah,
these cooperatives you say are forming?
Yeah, well, and it's a good point because I used the wrong word. I should not have said cooperatives because that's a very specific thing in this case. These are more secondary level organizations. They're not cooperatives in the sense of agrarian reform. Mark Becker has done a lot of work in this area of Ecuador on agrarian reform and on leftist organizing since the 1930s, including the Ley de Comunas in 1937. So the way that cooperatives and agrarian reform happened in different provinces across the country, as you know, wasn't equal. And Cayambe was one of the areas that had the law of communes, the Ley de Comunas. Only one in the year after that was actually formed, an actual commune. Right? And it was because the indigenous sort of communities and organizers were suspect of the state trying to take, what's that?
Communism, that was very, very strong in Cayambe.
Right, exactly. And so they were afraid that the state was trying to actually appropriate their communes, right, the communal organization, the comunas, for the purposes of the state. And so they actually resisted that for a long time. And it wasn't until really the 70s that those started to form. Now there are comunas, legally recognized comunas, but Mark Becker talks about how in Cayambe, it was really the cooperative form that seemed to sort of take hold more, that they were more willing to form cooperatives as opposed to comunas, because they didn't want to be appropriated by the state. So that's kind of my sense of it. Today, those organizations that I was talking about, that sort of multi-level, taking communities and organizing them. So it'll be like peasant organizations, campesino organizations, that are kind of bringing communities together and organizing them to increase their own political power. So when I said cooperatives, that was the wrong word to describe them, and that's an important point.
I wanted to ask if you ever read Muriel Crespi's dissertation. Yes.
Yeah. In Pesillo, yeah, and that was, because it was done as sort of cultural ecology, and so I was interested in how the cultural ecology was coming into that as well. And Crespi that was from University of Illinois as well, I think.
Right. And she was very focused on material culture inside of the house, describing exactly what was on every wall.
Exactly. Yeah. It was such a great resource for reading how that was done, and it's an important area, right, for some of these indigenous leaders like Dolores Cacuango and Tránsito Amaguaña, coming from that area, from the
time period that she was observing.
Yeah.
So, just wondered.
Yeah, definitely.
Any other final questions for Zev?
Sorry, I had one more actually. You had a slide describing the contract that would happen in the hacienda. I wondered how they would enforce that contract. You mentioned like stockades and things like that. Was that part of the enforcement, or what kind of strategies did they employ?
Yeah, it's interesting that you asked that. I mean, those contracts. I mean, some people did move out of debt, but then there wasn't really much opportunity outside anyway. I mean, they wanted to stay in their communities with their kin groups, right? And so that was sort of the way of kind of tethering them to that land, that this was their ancestral land and they were part of these kin groups. And they continued those contracts by enforcing debt upon the future generations as well. And I also have archival examples of those contracts for minors. So you would have the two parent signers, and they couldn't sign because they weren't literate. They would say that these were the two parents, and they were agreeing that their kid would also be a part of this arrangement. There was definitely physical violence that was enforcing it. There was spatial violence, the spatial organization, and the Wasipungo itself. There's a foundational novel in the country called Wasipungo, and that's the importance of the Wasipungo to their social identity and sense of self, that this was their home, right? And they could be kicked off of it by the landowner at any time, but they cared for it, and it was important to them, so they sort of wouldn't just kind of get up and leave. So yeah, I mean, and there are cases, legal cases. I mean, the debt was taken seriously because there were cases where, because of the abuses, they were going to authorities asking for the debt to be forgiven because days of work hadn't been counted or because of the abuses. Right? So clearly the debt was taken seriously. And those records were preserved, and the hacienda itself also took seriously new laws that were passed. So you can see sometimes they were actually asking for clarification, like what exactly does it mean that that we can't have the wife of somebody also work? Like we can't make her also work if she's not contracting. And so they're actually asking for clarifications on the law, even though it's this sort of rural periphery, right, where they probably and did get away with a lot of things. So there was certainly a legal presence there that was important.
Thank you.
Okay, unless there are any other questions, I think we can wrap it up for the evening. Again, this was a fantastic conversation that you facilitated, Zev. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed it. Before we all log off, just a quick reminder about next month's event. It will be held on Tuesday, May 4th. This talk is going to be held, our guest speaker will be Dr. Deborah Tannen, professor of linguistics at Georgetown University. And she will be talking about her book, Finding My Father, His Century-Long Journey from World War I Warsaw and My Quest to Follow. So hopefully you can join us for that event. And again, we want to thank Zev for a wonderful conversation, learning about another region of the world, very appropriate with the timely spring weather that is producing a lot of lovely flowers.
Great history that you put together.
Absolutely, thank you.
And the eastern shore of Maryland is producing a lot of flowers, cut flowers as well. So it's emerging here as a local industry, a local production.
Great.
But thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks to everyone for joining. We hope to see you next month. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.